I'm so happy to introduce our very special guest today, Shawn Grain Carter, Professor of Marketing at Fashion Institute of Technology, who had first spoken here beginning on January 13th, 2000, the year 2000, on the topic Marketing in the Internet. Each year after that, Shawn has spoken in January, as that is the month that FIT, Fashion Institute of Technology, is closed. Shawn has spoken on so many different topics throughout the years, like the internet and distant learning, which was in 2002 and which could be repeated now in today's educational system. And this past January, Shawn had spoken on the topic, the generational divide in American politics. Because of Zoom, Shawn is able to speak to us in October today, where the timing is perfect for her topic, Democracy Sweepstakes. I can't wait to hear it, as I know it will be fascinating and informative. Before we begin, I would just like to say to our library and myself, we are so fortunate to have known Shawn's very bright and very beautiful Lindsay, her daughter, who worked here as a page before she graduated from Mount Holyoke and worked as a teacher and in Washington, D.C., before her very untimely and tragic passing. I know she was as proud of her mother as her mother was proud of her. So I just had to say that because I loved Lindsay as she was my best page. And Shawn, you're terrific. And thank you so much for being so wonderful to our library community. So now it gives me, I mean it. So now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our very special guest and friend, Shawn Grain Carter.
Oh, thank you, Phyllis.
You're
Thank you so much. Well, I just want to first of all say I'm wearing this color lavender in honor of my daughter, Lindsay, who did pass away from cancer exactly 2 years ago. And she loved the library because I'm an active bibliophile. I love the library, and it serves such a critical role in our communities and in our world. And I think that people often think of libraries just as a place for scholars to research their theses or for students to do their homework, but it's for lifelong learners such as yourselves. And I'm so appreciative of you joining me today so that we can talk about democracy sweepstakes. And yes, the election is November 3rd, Tuesday. I voted early. I'm sure all of you have voted.
I did too.
And ironically, we're going to also talk about media and its role in the election, particularly this year. So one of the things that I wanted to start by sharing with you is a few facts, which I think you'll find interesting. The grandfather of media is radio. And after radio, television was born. And after broadcast network television, we had cable television. And after cable television, we had satellite media for radio as well as television. And now we have social media. So 100 years ago today, radio broadcast the results of the 1920 presidential election. And it was the first time the presidential election had been broadcast via a media platform. And so I thought it would be interesting for us to explore the role of media and how it has changed in terms of its influence on national elections in the United States today, particularly with the advent of Facebook and Instagram and TikTok and all of these different social media platforms. People tend to not realize that they're getting a lot of misinformation and disinformation, which is circulating and percolating on the media, which can influence a person's decision and how they vote or how they view some of the issues that are facing voters in the electorate. And so I wanted to talk about that so that we could have a robust dialogue regardless of whether you are on the Republican side or an independent or a Democrat. All of us have a stake in being what I call good digital citizens. And I'm going to talk more specifically about what that means in terms of our democracy, because we live in a representative democracy. It's not parliamentarian like in the UK. It's a representative democracy. And ironically, people don't realize that the democracy that has the most populous number of citizens in the world is actually India. And so, contrary to popular belief, democracy is under attack. However, it is still thriving. And we have to do our part as digital citizens to ensure not only that it survives for the next generation and other generations to come in America and throughout the world, but also because there is a lot at stake and we want to be informed digital citizens. So I want to give you an important date because everyone's talking about November 3rd. But this is a date I want you to pay attention to. December 14th. And December 14th is when the electors that make up and comprise the Electoral College vote for the next president of the United States of America. The 46th president will be inaugurated on January 21st, unless the Electoral College votes to reappoint the 45th president. So many people are looking at November 3rd, and I am suggesting that you all pay attention to December 14th. That's when the electors vote. Now, let me tell you about the Electoral College. I'm sure all of you are paying attention because right now we have many more toss-up states in the Electoral College than people thought we would have. So electors are chosen by their political parties in every single state. And these electors, you have one elector per congressional district. And so depending on how many congressional districts each state has determines, how many electors they will have representing the state. So these electors then are supposed to do the will of the people based on the popular vote, which occurs on November 3rd. And so some of the questions that are coming up now, because this is such a different election than previous elections, is, well, what happens if all the votes aren't counted? Well, let me tell you something that you might not be aware of. There are states that by their laws in their particular state do not have to have all of the votes counted by November 3rd. And what our US Constitution did was empower the states to make a lot of decisions about how we vote, where we vote, and the qualifications to vote. And then if you get down to the level of county, a lot of people don't realize that you can live in the same state and your county can determine that they're going to vote a different way from another county. So I think that as good digital citizens, we have to pay closer attention to the role of the state, the role of our state legislatures, the role of our local county legislatures, and pay more attention to how we vote for state politicians. How do we vote for our local president? In Maplewood, we have a mayor. In South Orange, we have a president. And so it's important as good digital citizens for us to think about this in terms of how these outcomes then affect the national level, the national dialogue in terms of states' rights and national rights. So one of the things that I found fascinating, which I didn't realize, is that there's been a little chatter, political chatter, about state legislatures deciding that they will go against the will of the popular vote. And they will tell the electors on December 14th that you're going to vote for the candidate that we say you're going to vote for. Now, why is this a concern? Because we have more state legislatures that are Republican right now than Democratic. And we also have the majority of the governors in the United States right now who are Republican and not Democratic. And so there's been a concern that, oh my goodness, can the electors on December 14th decide that regardless of the popular vote in that particular state, they're going to vote for whom they feel that they want to be the next president. Well, actually, they're not allowed to do that because our founding fathers had the foresight to make sure that Congress created something called the Safe Harbor Act as part of the Electoral College Act. And what that means is Congress has stated, and it's in the law, that the state legislature must make sure that they enforce the electors doing their job based on the will of the people. And what that means is the will of the people determine the popular vote on November 3rd, and the electors must go with the will of the people. Now, you might not realize, but in the last presidential election, we did have a couple of electors who defected, meaning that they did not vote with the will of the party. So they were fined $1,000 in depending on the state. I can't remember whether it was Nevada or Arizona, but it was one of those Midwestern states where the electorate decided they were not going to go with the full will of the people. And so they voted differently, and they were fined some money. But what I want you to know is that once the popular vote is decided, all of the electors must vote for however that state's popular vote outcome is. Now, there is an exception. We have 2 states in the United States that split the vote of their electors based on percentages of the voting that takes place in their state. And yes, that is allowed by law because of states' rights. So I'm going to tell you those 2 states because I was fascinated to find this out. Nebraska is allowed to split their electoral vote based on percentage, and so is Maine. Now, why is Maine such an interesting state to look at in terms of what's going on in politics? Because we have a competitive senatorial race in Maine. And we have a woman senator running, and she's running against another woman opponent. And, Ms. Collins is running a very tight competitive race, which she did not anticipate only maybe a year ago. So we're seeing competitive races, and that's what makes a democracy interesting, is to see different people running for office who were not formally in government. And so I think you're seeing upstarts in different parts of the country, and that's what a representative democracy allows. After the decision by the Supreme Court of Citizens United to allow as much money to influence politics, which I think was one of the worst Supreme Court decisions besides Plessy v. Ferguson, which allowed you to have segregation by law, and that's a whole different topic. But the Citizens United decision under Justice Roberts' Supreme Court allowed money to flood and influence our elections on state levels, national levels, and local levels. And what it has done is it's made money, unfortunately, such a powerful tool to not have always the best people running for office. Because if you can't fundraise, it's as good as you're not being able to run a campaign because you don't have the financial wherewithal to do so. So, Citizens United, in my opinion, was the worst decision for our democracy. However, what we're seeing is that people are now fundraising, and they're making our democracy more competitive in this election cycle than I've seen in a long time. So another example besides Maine, which is running a competitive senatorial race, because what people don't think about on election day is that the Senate serves 6 years. The president serves 4 unless he's reelected, and your Congress people serve 2 unless they're reelected. And so when you think about the Senate, they have a very good job. They have it better than the president, and they have it better really than the House members of Congress, because they get to sit for 6 years in their offices. And so these competitive senatorial races are going to make a huge difference in regardless of who's elected president. It will make a difference in terms of if we have any more Supreme Court appointees, for example. And so pay close attention to the senatorial races. Right now, Lindsey Graham never thought he would be in trouble with Harrison. Okay, so there are some interesting contested races. Take a look at Amy McGrath. She's in Kentucky. Amy is running against McConnell. Okay, and there's been a lot of money to support her. She has a military background and she's a woman. She ran for office before and lost, but she is back and she's running now for the Senate. So we are seeing some very interesting races across the country. And I think people have to pay attention because it's the Electoral College that chooses our next president. Yes, we're all voting. And one of the things that's also interesting during this pandemic is already 72 million people have voted. Now, in the electorate, based on the fact that we have about over 330 million people in the United States, the electorate is comprised of those voters who actually are eligible to vote, okay? And that's about 141 or 42 million people. Already, we have seen 50% of the electorate cast their vote already. That is shocking, and it's also unprecedented. So that's why even though the last time the polls got it wrong, we're paying closer and closer attention to the polls because with social media and with big data, we are able to figure out these algorithms a lot better than we did last time. That doesn't mean that they're perfect. There's always up 4 or minus 4 percentage points in terms of whether or not that's an accurate statistic. But pay attention to the patterns and what we call in marketing the data mining. If you look at the patterns, there are a couple of demographic groups that are voting in record numbers. And one of them is Generation Z. That's the youngest generation we have of eligible voters right now. But they cut a broad swath across the spectrum when it comes to how they view politics. So a lot of people would presume that all of them vote Democratic, and that's really not true. Yes, there are a sizable number that are considered progressive, but there are also quite a few who are conservative, who lean on their evangelical beliefs. And so we are looking at this new Generation Z that doesn't necessarily get their election information from network news like we might look at on ABC, CBS, NBC. They get their news, unfortunately, from Facebook or Instagram, and even TikTok, which obviously are not the most credible sources of information to gather how are you going to vote for your next senator or congressperson or president. And so one of the things I teach my students is how to identify sources of media information that has integrity, that is verifiable in terms of facts, and whose sources are legitimate, whose sources are scholarly, whose sources are verifiable. And that's important, particularly in this campaign, because there is a lot of misinformation and disinformation being circulated right now throughout the country. And people want to say, oh, it's Russia, it's China, it's Iran. Well, it's not just them, it's us. We are sending misinformation via our emails or our text messages or just plain old neighborhood gossip, not checking to see if it's verifiable, not checking to see, well, where was the source of this information? And so I want to pivot and talk to you a little bit about the role of media, and I'm including traditional media, which is radio and television, as well as the cable news cycle, which is so fast now, and then pivoting towards Facebook. because most of our students, whether they're in high school or college, are getting the information via the Apple News on their phone, or BuzzFeed, or Huffington Post. Not necessarily, the New York Times, the Financial Times, Barron's, Washington Post. So I think one of the things that you might not realize is that in 2011, we had something that was dismissed called the Fairness Doctrine. The Fairness Doctrine was a law that said all broadcast media, print media, and social media had to always give both sides of an issue. And they had to be objective and present this information for the viewers and the readers and the listeners to decide for themselves. Now, one of the decisions that President Obama made, because each president gets to appoint the commissioner for the FCC, and that's the Federal Communications Commission. In 2011, President Obama said, well, we have so many rules and regulations that we don't need the Fairness Doctrine anymore. Now, he didn't personally say that, but his chief FCC chairman said it and did away with it. So we wonder why the proliferation of these echo chambers is what I call them in media, where that Fox News leans right, that CNN leans left. If we had enforced the Fairness Doctrine, they would not be able to get away with that. And they would be, although they make an attempt to present both sides of an issue, it's not as thorough as one of my favorite trusted news sources, which is public television. PBS, Public Broadcasting System, is an excellent news source, as well as NPR, National Public Radio. And there are others besides those two. But I promote public radio and public television because they still utilize the Fairness Doctrine. And they don't try to allow their opinions, if you will, to masquerade as actual news. They really present the information. They do their best to always have opposite ends of the spectrum. Sometimes it's more than even two people. It might be three people with different points of view on a controversial subject or a benign subject. But they really do try to adhere to the Fairness Doctrine in making sure that their audience listens to a variety of viewpoints, regardless of how you feel personally about a particular subject. And that goes back to, if you think about it, old-fashioned debate clubs, which we had in schools, and where you had an issue and you were chosen to defend or refute that issue based on information, based on facts, how you came up with your deductive reasoning to draw conclusions, and present it and debate it. And these debate clubs allowed students and allowed people to develop this notion of how to view different ideas that are controversial, that you might not agree with, but to listen to the other side, to use information that was vetted in terms of sources and materials, and to let that be your guide in how you formulated an opinion about a particular subject. So losing the Fairness Doctrine certainly has not helped in terms of misinformation and disinformation that is circulating online as well as offline. And so one of the other things you might want to think about is there is something called the Election Integrity Partnership. And what they do is they have facts that they list on any number of issues that impact the presidential campaign as well as local and state campaigns. And you can use them as a nonpartisan source to figure out, what's the real deal in terms of this particular issue and what are the facts that are worth understanding so that I can decide for myself what I think about this particular issue. So another thing I wanted to share with you is that there are ways that you can, as a digital citizen yourself, help not spread misinformation and disinformation. You might not be up on memes and trolls and all these things that the younger people like Millennials and Gen Z are aware of, but there are ways that you can also make sure that you are a smart, wise, informed citizen. And so here's some suggestions that I have, and then we'll go to Q&A so that I can give you as much time as you want to ask me your questions. So one of the things that you should think about when you get an email, or if you're on Facebook and you get someone that shares something that says this was shared by a friend of a friend. Well, first of all, not everybody is your friend. I tell that to my students. I don't care what it says on Instagram or Facebook. You don't have 1,000 friends. You've not met these people. You don't know who they are. Sometimes they're avatars, memes, trolls. You don't really know. So the first thing you might want to do is whatever was sent to you, look up the authorship of that article, of that tweet, of that Instagram post. Look up the authorship and see if this person has published any kind of news articles or scholarly journals, or if other media sources that you consider worthy of being a source that is verifiable, if they have picked up anything from this particular author. And that will give you an idea of whether or not there is some validity to the subject matter based on the authorship. And a lot of people, don't want to take the time to do that, but it's important to do. I'll give you an example that happened to me because, I don't think I'm worthy of being trolled, but I am a member of Goodreads, which is a digital book club, and you get to, talk about your favorite books and rank them and all that kind of thing. And it's online. Unfortunately, they're owned by Amazon, but that's another conversation. And so the other day, I wrote a book review, and I received a response in my email saying that I had someone following me because of my book review that I posted. And the person, I just thought it was odd because I thought, there's no information about where this person works, where they live. And so I thought, why would they be following me? And it was a woman, redhead, just looked like a person who was maybe in her 40s. So when I went into my Goodreads profile to say, to see who this person was following me, and I looked up, as much information as I could. Where does she live? What's her occupation? What books does she like? The whole page was blank. It was totally empty. Then when I looked a little further, the language was in Russian. So I could not translate it. And then I realized I was being trolled. I was being followed. They thought, so I clicked a little button to say that I will not allow this person to follow me, because you can do that. So I clicked the button to not allow this person to follow me. And what I realized is that, they wrote something to me, but it was disinformation. It was misinformation. They were trying to, ascertain my opinions about things just based on some book reviews that I had done. So it happens to all of us, whether we realize it or not. People don't realize, they think that this only happens to celebrities and politicians and, people who might write op-ed pieces, but it happens to all of us because we don't realize the role of Facebook and Google is about advertising, and the roles that they play in misinformation and disinformation is about whether it's the far left, the far right, or whomever, Russians, Iranians, Americans. They just want to generate likes, generate advertising revenue so that they can make a profit. And that's one of the reasons that they're going through congressional hearings about antitrust provisions being possibly broken, because the role of social media today is playing an outside role in terms of how we work, how we elect presidents and senators, how we socialize, how we learn. I mean, we're using social media platforms throughout everything we do in life today. And so they need to be held more accountable in terms of misinformation and disinformation and in their role in a democratic society. So checking authorship, checking sources, that's one strategy that I can share with you in terms of trying to not be part of getting psyched out in terms of misinformation. The second thing is stop, investigate, find, and trace. That's not easy to do. But one of the things that PBS suggested, which I thought was great, and I shared with my class, is take a look at the visual, because oftentimes you have things like Adobe and other platforms that can take a person's face, they can take a person's visual, and they take it out of context. And so you're looking at something that you think is an accurate visual, and it's not. It's something that is not an accurate visual. And so that's not easy to do. My students actually can do it better than I. But, take a look, and you can go to Google Images and just sometimes take a look and see, does this visual of this person doing this look accurate, or does something look a little suspicious to you? So that's one thing that you can do. The other thing is, when you get a post or a tweet or an email or something or an article, take that article if you can, if you're looking at it online, and compare it to the article in a different media publication, particularly if it's syndicated. And that'll give you all kinds of citations for the article. Look at the bottom and see if it makes sense to you, if it's something that looks legitimate. And so these are little tips that will help you become kind of a sleuth, kind of a misinformation, disinformation detective, if you will. But it'll help you in the long run be a better citizen. And the last thing I would suggest is, understand the difference between opinions and real objective criteria. Journalists are supposed to do 5 things: who, what, when, where, how. Period. That's what they're supposed to do. Who did it? What happened? Where did it happen? How did it happen? They're supposed to also use a minimum of 3 sources to verify whatever it is they're reporting on. But what we've had in the past 10 years proliferate is people interjecting their opinion when they're not supposed to. And so it's difficult to tell the difference these days between a real journalist, a pundit, and an investigative news reporter and a news personality. It's so hard to tell because everybody is just trying to get ratings, as opposed to offer real information that you can digest, that you can synthesize, that you can take the time to just reflect about and draw your own conclusion and formulate your own opinion. So I leave you with this idea of paying attention to November 3rd, but also pay attention to December 14th. Be good digital citizens and ask as many questions as you want, because this is important. We all have a role to play. And it's interesting, I would say after Gen Z, the next sizable demographic that's voting like crazy in this election are millennials. The oldest millennial right now is 38 years old. And the youngest millennial is 27, 26. So that is a large demographic. And for the first time, that demographic in terms of numbers is higher than baby boomers. The baby boomer demographic is those who were born 1945 to 1964. So I will tell you that a lot of people are paying attention to the senior citizens in Florida voting, and they're paying attention to, Ohio. I would also tell you, pay attention to Gen Z, who's voting for the first time, and pay attention to millennials, because they are voting in droves on both sides of the aisle. And they're also making these races more competitive. And then lastly, I would say, obviously, you have more, people of color throughout the country voting. And I'm not talking about just, Blacks and, Latinos. you have Asians voting in droves, and you have South Asians, so people of Bangladesh or India or Pakistani descent. I mean, so this is a fascinating election, and be good digital citizens. And if you haven't already, make sure you vote. Okay, so I'll open it up to the audience, and you can ask me as many questions as you like.
You were phenomenal. You were so good and so informative. I swear I learned so much from you today, and I think all of us did. Can I ask the first question?
Sure.
I want to hear about your students. Do they tell you honestly what they think, and do they argue back and forth within the class?
Oh, yes. My students are not shy.
This is the
And-
Generation Z.
Yeah, Generation Z, very much like the Millennials, are used to having their say, because we have raised them to believe that they can formulate and have an opinion about everything, even if they're not full grown adults. So one of the big things that Generation Z and Millennials have talked about a lot is gun legislation. And I have students from Texas and stuff. So, you know, this is a big issue. Even I have students who are from upstate New York, for example, which views gun legislation very differently than folks maybe in the 5 boroughs of Manhattan, New York, Queens, Brooklyn. And so, and South Jersey, I'll use New Jersey. South Jersey tends to be more conservative in certain areas than Northern Jersey. And so our students have robust discussions about what does it mean when Walmart says they will not allow you to purchase a gun anymore off the aisle, but you can go in a store and request that someone allow you to get the gun. Dick's Sporting Goods and other retailers have made a decision not to make it so easy to purchase a gun anymore in the physical store. And this is because this is the generation that has lived with Parkland in terms of Florida, when you had that terrible mass shooting. But it's also the same generation that was young and grew up with what happened in Connecticut. So that's an issue that is very much on the minds of this generation, along with student debt. And, you know, what can we do about student debt, since for the first time in the history of this country, student debt exceeds consumer debt. And, you know, it's shocking when you think about it. So those are two issues that have robust conversations with the students in terms of who they think in terms of issues and policy decisions that matter to them in this election.
Now it's great. So it's fascinating what you're dealing with them.
It is fascinating. You know, they are seeing things happen so rapidly, and they are concerned. I mean, think about climate change and Greta Thunberg. They don't understand why that's even a political issue. They really don't. And so for them, they think that they're the generation that's going to be living with these decisions, and they want people to address it because they don't see it as a political issue. They see it as an issue that's a generational issue, frankly.
But is there any questions?
I have a question.
Great.
Okay.
Hey, Shawn, it's Tracy.
Hi.
Hi. With regard to your students, I know in various populations, perhaps not those that we traditionally think of, perhaps those we traditionally think of, are single issue voters. To what extent are you finding single issue voters in that student population, you know, the Gen Zs, the Gen Xs, and the Millennials?
Oh, that's a great question. So I'll repeat the question to make sure everybody heard it. You know, what percentage of these students and young adults are single issue voters? Pew Research actually did a little bit of research on that. And what we're finding is that they are not as much of a single issue voter as the older generation. They are more of a multi-issue voting population demographic. So here's an example. PBS a few weeks ago did a whole audience after the vice presidential debate, and they had done one previously with the first presidential debate. And they had some young people who were conservative. There was a young man, he was from Tennessee. He was in a suit and nobody else was wearing a suit. And he said, you know, this is how I was raised. I'm a Christian, I'm evangelical. I have to wear a suit because mama would be appalled if I didn't. And, you know, some of the other kids I thought who would, you know, just be voting on things like Black Lives Matter or police corruption or, you know, things like that. I thought those would only be the issues that they're interested in. And I have to tell you, when Amna Nawaz interviewed these young people, I was quite surprised at the issues that they said they were voting on. And they only, you know, they distilled it to like 3 issues. And what came up often was, you know, not so much the quote economy. What came up is employment, student debt, but also fairness and integrity. Fairness and integrity came up a lot. And it meant different things to different students. So one of the things that came up was fairness in terms of giving people the opportunity, not so much to quote, live the American dream, but to have access to education and to have access to career opportunities. That is not a zero-sum game.
Right.
They were very, very on both sides of the aisle, very engaged in that. But where they differed was on gun legislation. And they also differed on the role of demonstrations in terms of civic life. Even the conservative ones said, you know, we get it, you know, because we protest, we don't believe in abortion. But that's not the only issue that we're voting on. Whereas older adults, there are some who say, well, you know, I'm Catholic, or I am conservative, or I am an evangelical Christian, and I will only vote for, you know, Trump, let's say, because he is putting a Supreme Court justice on the court who will strike down Roe v. Wade. And otherwise, I don't really care for Trump personally, but I'm going to vote because of that. The young people were much more engaged in terms of multi-issue concerns. And for them, they kind of calculate it and go, this is the way I'm going to go because of this, because they also said they didn't like Biden and Trump, frankly. They were very much, you know, one group really loved Biden. And the other group, it was interesting, they actually liked Pence better than Trump. They thought Pence was more presidential. And, you know, so it was very interesting to hear their points, but they weren't single issue voters, not, and I find in my classes, they're not either. They are, I would say, easily 3 issues, if not more. So thank you for your question.
Yeah, that's actually good to hear that they're looking at a broader like landscape of issues and having to do some research around them to formulate appropriate opinions.
Yes. And you know why? I'll tell you why I see that happening with them. Because even though, you know, I get on their case about credible news sources, they communicate with kids from all over the world. You know, whether it's Instagram or TikTok, they are communicating across not just, you know, racial and ethnic and class boundaries, but national and cultural boundaries. And so, you know, they talk to people who live differently from them outside of this country. And, you know, they're interested in understanding, well, you know, what do you think about what's going on in Hong Kong now that you've got the one China rule? And why do you think that it's a good thing? And why do you think it's not a good thing? And so, you know, we're protesting. Why is it that the protests are called riots by some people and demonstrations by other, and words matter? And so these are the conversations they're engaged in. And I think it makes for a richer dialogue, but also causes them to look at issues in a more complex way. There's not just this or that. And I think that's why they're not just single issue voters.
Are there less students nowadays because of the price of the university?
Interesting question. I think you mean in terms of enrollment.
Yeah.
For the first year students, yes, but not so for the juniors and the seniors. First year students, many of them are taking a gap year in public colleges as well as private colleges. However, the juniors and the seniors in particular, they want to be done and get on with their lives. And so they don't like the fact that they're missing out on their celebrations, for instance, like commencement, their senior year activities, but they see the value in finishing up because the cost of living is so expensive and the cost of debt is so expensive, and they want to be able to go into the workplace and get on with their adult lives because, you know, they are concerned that that opportunity is just becoming like quicksand. And so they are very interested in getting out there. And, you know, the things that we talk about is the economy in the world as well as in the United States goes in cycles. And so, you know, you can't think that everything is going to just go south just because we're in a volatile situation economically with this pandemic. I said consumer demand drives the economy in the United States. 2/3 of our GDP is driven by consumers. And I said, I got to tell you, people have pent up demand. If you look at the sales were up in September. They're still up. They're just buying different things. I mean, because we're all at home. So whether we're home working or learning or unemployed, you know, for example, we have to wash our hands, okay, to fend off the pandemic. Well, soap, all different kinds of soaps are selling, not just, you know, soap to wash your hands, but fragrance soap and this kind of soap. Candles are selling because people are stressed out. So, you know, they're being told meditate, you know, exercise. So candles are selling like crazy. You know, it's a different time, but also with these kind of dark times is opportunity. And I tell the students that. I said, you know, when I graduated, it was a recession, it was the Iran-Iraq war, and we were protesting against the Bakke decision about affirmative action. And I said, all these things come in waves, and it's a robust way to exercise your democratic right. I'm so thrilled to see students protesting. And we were talking about what's different from the 70s and the 60s. And I said, it's such a broader coalition. I mean, it's much broader. It's Asians, it's whites, it's blacks, it's Latinos, it's transgender, it's, you know, it's just everything and in between. And their identity is different. It's a different type of fluidity. They don't identify the same way we do, even in terms of how they see themselves. So they're, you know, millennials and Gen Z are a very fascinating generation to watch. And as they assume these leadership roles, watch out, because they have quite a different agenda than baby boomers, you know, who have been the fortunate ones to ride this economic wave. I mean, we've benefited from all the stuff, but we're also the ones making the mistakes. And that's why you see this generational tug also evidence in the workplace. Now, I will also say they're not perfect. They're spoiled. They don't have necessarily the same work ethic as baby boomers and Generation X. And they're all interested in work-life balance before they're even on the job for 30 days. So, I mean, they're definitely different. They're definitely different, but they have great ideas. They have to be, you know, we have to help them become more disciplined to execute them and to stick with them, and to also learn how to fail, because they're afraid of failure, because they're given awards for doing nothing. You know, they show up on a team and they don't have to win, but they get a little, you know, trophy. That's something that they're learning to deal with. They're not used to failure. And so they fear that. And so one of the things we're learning and we're helping them to understand is that you surviving this pandemic and coming out on the other side is going to be a success, but you're learning how to fail forward, because this is life. You're not going to do everything in a perfect way, and you're not going to make perfect grades all the time.
You are a perfect teacher.
No, I'm not, but I will admit to my failures. My students know. I will admit when I err in judgment or when I say something and they go, oh no, fact check, Professor Carter, fact check, we know, blah, blah, blah.
Well, you taught us a lot and you do it in such a wonderful way. Is there another question? I'm sorry. It's very hard to tell when you're not. Do you hear anything? No.
I think they're muted. You might want to unmute. Okay, now that you're unmuted, you can ask them if they have other questions, because I think some of your
Do you have any
participants are
other
muted.
questions?
Mhm.
Right, some of you, if you muted yourself, you need to unmute if you want to ask a question. You don't need to do that part yourself. Hi, Shawn, it's Melissa.
Hi,
Thank
Melissa.
you for doing this.
Oh, sure.
Oh, I could put my face back on. I just didn't want to take away from your lovely face. And Phyllis has a little creepy Halloween thing going where her face is disappearing into her background.
That's because I told you, Lenny changed the background and we don't know how to
It looks so wonderfully ghosty.
Spooky, yeah.
Oh,
That was so very interesting. I appreciate it.
well, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. Did
Oh,
you
and
have a
Clara
question?
has a question.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's not a question, but I like the idea that you're teaching your students and encouraging them to verify,
Yes.
check. And I remember when years ago, when I was doing testing for the State Department, one of the things that I would tell people, if your mother says she loves you, check it out.
Now that's
That was to shock people into how seriously you can't just take it for granted. You have to check it out.
Yes. And it's interesting that you say that, because one of the things that Pew Research and other people polled, older people, they were saying, tend to vote the way the other spouse voted. That used to be the way it is. But as you get younger and younger, there are split votes, happening. And it's fascinating, because before, women would vote the way the husbands voted. And, I find with my students, some of them, they arrive, they just vote the way the family votes because that's all they knew how to vote. But then they graduate and the parents are a little concerned because now they're voicing opinions and they're just voting the way they want to vote.
the freedom that they have, right?
Yes, the freedom to be an adult and the responsibility.
Yes, the responsibility.
Speaking of responsibility, I have one more question. Related to the concept of student debt and the fact that it's risen beyond consumer debt at this point. Do your students actually banter around different ideas as to how to address the student debt issue, as well as the rising astronomical cost of a college education today?
Yes, that is a conversation that is happening quite a bit. And I'll tell you, one of the things that our students did not know, for example, is that we lost the vote in Congress by one vote to have a fixed low interest rate on student loans, whether they were public loans or private loans.
Wow.
So I told them, I said, look, that's why voting matters, not just every 4 years, but, for your congressional candidates, because they cost you money and opportunity for debt forgiveness. And it's not just debt forgiveness that the students want. One of the things that we have been talking about, even as educators, the financial aid packages are deceiving. And I'll tell you why. I can speak to this as a parent as well as an educator. When they put together the aid package, many students often don't realize I should look at what percentage of this is loans versus grants. And there's such a difference. And so they get the aid package and they think, oh, I have financial aid. And they realize, oh my God, it's dependent on me taking out mountains of debt. The second thing that we're saying, so we think more colleges need to give, particularly students who have Pell Grants and students who are coming from middle class and working class families. They need more grants in the aid package and fewer loans. So that's one way we can easily reduce debt. The second thing is that we should not reduce a student's financial aid if they get scholarships. And that's something that the colleges do across the board. If you get a certain scholarship, then they reduce your aid. That's ridiculous. And a third thing that happens, students are encouraged to only apply to public colleges if they are students of color, because they're told that's all you can afford. That is such a misnomer, and it's so misguided. I tell students, look at the private colleges and look at the public colleges with the largest endowment, because they have the money to give you a better scholarship and financial aid package. And many of them will give you 100%. And the other thing that I would say is that, and the students are really paying attention to this. Oftentimes you have these programs like New York State has the Excelsior program, which just came into being a couple of years ago, but it only pays for tuition. It doesn't cover books, which are astronomical. It only covers housing if you live on campus. It doesn't cover housing if it's cheaper for you to live off campus. So these are debt issues that can strangle a student. And for many students, their understanding of how to fill out the FAFSA and the CSS profile, it's like you need to hire an accountant to explain it. It's unfair to the student, and it's unfair to those families also that have never filled out these applications. And so we need to, number one, stop giving out so many loans for students to finish. I think you could give them, some loans. They can have skin in the game, but it should not be them graduating with $100,000 in debt when they finish. I think if they graduate with $10,000, that's workable. But 100, 70, 50, it's unacceptable. And we should demand better from our institutions in terms of meeting the needs of our students, because this is happening. And people think, oh, it's just minority students. Well, that's another misnomer. It's a lot of white students too who can't afford these colleges. And what we have going on is we're creating a tiered system of the elite, no matter who they are, because what we do in the education system these days is higher ed. They have 30% of the kids coming from out of the country because they don't have to give them any kind of scholarship money. So that they pay full freight. Then they get the athletes, and they get those students who are, great, let's say, players in the symphony or whatever. So they have spots reserved for them. And then it's everybody else, unless your parents have endowed a chair at the college, or you are lucky enough, some institutions do have legacy. But I have to tell you, legacy is not as big a factor as if you're wealthy and well-connected. And athletes, believe it or not, we pay coaches in the college higher ed more than we pay college presidents. So, we need to be honest in terms of also addressing the difference between public loans and private loans for these kids. The private sector, when you get a loan from Chase Bank, it's very different than when you get it through higher education government loan. That government loan is going to be cheaper, and that can also be forgiven. It's much more difficult to forgive a private loan because the banks don't care. They make money off of these kids. So all these kinds of things, I think we need to disseminate earlier and sooner so that all parents can make an informed decision. And part of that is that we don't have enough guidance counselors in the high schools who are able to articulate all of this to the kids, because there's not enough of them for all the students. And we don't have what I call financial literacy. We don't have these conversations, and they're important conversations to have.
Well, you have really given us a wonderful, wonderful talk. And I look forward to seeing you in the library.
I look forward to checking out my next book.
And of course, and I know that you will be coming back in the spring. And I
Yes,
have
I
no idea
will.
whether it'll be online or in the library, but either way,
Okay.
you're wonderful. Thank you
Have a
again.
great weekend, everybody. Happy
Yeah.
Everyone be
Halloween.
well and
Thanks,
stay well.
Shawn.
Thank
I
you so
saw Shawn and Ashley's one day.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
Have a great weekend.
Okay, have a
Thank
good
you.
weekend. Yeah.